Okay, welcome everybody to Creative Mornings. Our topic is monumental, and I just want to start the session off with a territorial acknowledgement, and we acknowledge the Algonquin-speaking people, known more commonly today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, who have been the traditional stewards of this land, where this chapter of Creative Mornings takes place, and from where the Victoria Arts Council operates. So thank you, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Colette. So now I'm going to share some slides to thank our sponsors. So my name is Leah McInnes, and that was just Colette Batty, who is the president of the board of the Victoria Arts Council. So Creative Mornings is a global community, and the Victoria chapter is run by the Victoria Arts Council. And just to preface today's talk, since Creative Mornings is a global community, we just want to say that our hearts are with our friends and our creative communities in Ukraine. So welcome to today's Creative Mornings session. Today's theme is monumental. When we call something monumental, we mean it as a matter of scale. Societies erect statues and build squares and dedicate memorials to prevent the past from being buried. What will you bear witness to? What will you leave behind when you're gone? Our Richmond chapter chose this month's exploration of monumental, and mending walls illustrated the theme. We'd like to thank MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. This month, MailChimp would like you to know about their MailChimp & Co. benchmark report. Last year, MailChimp reached out to freelancers and independent agencies to learn about the nuts and bolts of their businesses. These learnings helped them create the 2021 MailChimp & Co. benchmark report, an invaluable resource for understanding how marketing pros stack up against their peers and revealing what top performers do differently. The 2022 survey is live, and MailChimp is looking for your feedback. They're asking if you have 15 minutes, please take the survey and share your thoughts. We'd like to thank the City of Victoria for their ongoing support, as well as HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences. So without further ado, oh wait, sorry, one last thing. I want to let you know about our upcoming exhibition at the Victoria Arts Council. It's called Crossroads. It's the Grand National Touring Quilt Show, and it will be opening on March 16th. It's a collection of quilts and fiber arts, so different explorations of the quilting medium. Okay, now without further ado, please join me in welcoming Crystal Przybille. Crystal is a Canadian award-winning artist. She has participated in artist residencies, including in the Netherlands and Nunavut. Przybille has exhibited nationally and in Europe, and has created a number of public artworks, including commemorative works exploring Canadian history and cultural narratives. Przybille has a Master of Fine Arts and is a sculpture instructor at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm going to be screen sharing shortly, but first of all, I'd like to say that I'm here in Kelowna, BC, and this is Syilx territory, unceded Syilx territory of the Okanagan people. And I was born here, I live here, and I work here. And today I'm going to be talking about my work with some monumental pieces, some public art pieces, and the learning that it brought me to and the experiences that I had along the way, because I was dealing with some issues of history of this area. And especially I'm talking about the history of the Victoria area from a monument that I created called The Hands of Time, which is in the downtown Victoria, the core around the James Bay area, as well as Beacon Hill Park. There's a circumference of area. It's a walking tour you can take and visit these 12 different pieces that are part of the Hands of Time. And so that was 10 years ago, the sesquicentennial of Victoria, that this particular piece was chosen to commemorate. So it's kind of a timely time to talk about that. So I'll be mentioning that and where my work went from there as well, and what brought me to doing that work in the way that I did that work. I want to say off the hop that my family history is from Europe. So on my maternal side, they come from Ireland, Wales, and England, arriving to North America from around 1600, sometime in the 1600s. And then on my father's side is more recent. He came over with his family when he was 10 from Germany after the Second World War. So that's where I have arrived here in Canada from these ancestors. So I'm going to start with a screen share now. Hopefully I can manage it. Okay. So I can see that we're going to have these images on the side, but that's okay. I'm going to move it over a little bit. I'm going to show this. Sorry, I got to figure out how to scroll on the screen share. It's a little different. There it is. This is the brochure that was published by the City of Victoria for the Hands of Time. And there's a map on the brochure where these different pieces are located, and a little silhouette of each of the images. So when I was invited to compete for this particular public art work, I went down to visit Victoria, and I had some experience already with a sculpture that I'll talk about shortly. Which brought me to first consult with the Lekwungen people and the Songhees people, an elder from the Songhees nation. And so I'll talk about what brought me to that. But these 12 pieces they all are symbolic of different aspects of the history of Victoria and that area. So this piece is called the Father Pandozzi Mission 150th Anniversary Commemorative Sculpture, and this is in Kelowna. This is at the Okanagan Mission Historical Site. This mission is the first Euro-Canadian settlement in the Okanagan, and it was founded by Oblate priests who preempted land around 1860. So when I was growing up in the Okanagan, like a lot of people, I had very little awareness of the Indigenous history of the area. I was aware of the settler history. I was aware of not that we were thinking about it in those terms, but the pioneering history, of which Father Pandozzi is one of the forefathers of. I lived in a little cabin near the Pandozzi Mission. It's also called the Pandozzi Mission colloquially. And I had lived there long enough to really think, well, why don't we have a statue of this man? He was so important in the Okanagan Valley. This was in my early 20s. And when I was much older, I was actually approached to make this work by the Okanagan Historical Society, who supported it. The caretaker had remembered me mentioning my desire to make this sculpture a long time ago, and he had set me up to talk to the Historical Society, and they supported this, as did the Canadian Heritage Fund. And there was a lot of community support for it at that time. This was around 2009. And people weren't thinking so much in terms of what these statues mean for a variety of people. When I started to research for this piece, that's when I started to experience cognitive dissonance. And that's because it became apparent that the histories that were being perpetuated were very one-sided. It was settler history, pioneer history. It had very little to do with Indigenous history. And when that was mentioned, it was usually often in derogatory terms, certainly in past tense, as though the Syilx people weren't still here. So I started to feel the weight of what this sculpture might be. And I talked to enough people and got enough good advice that I was directed to approach West Bank First Nation, which is something that I did nervously, and yet they welcomed me very open-heartedly. And we started to have a discussion about what this sculpture would mean, who Father Pandozzi was for their community, and what we might do together to make this sculpture more inclusive. So that started a collaboration, which was really, I received a letter of support from West Bank First Nation as well for this piece, because up to that time they had said that there had been no such collaborations made by the city or people who were planning to commemorate local history. There really was no communication. So this was a first on their, from their point of view. And so in it was included the food chiefs and Senclip, and these are all to create a certain amount of balance in contemplation about Pandozzi, what he brought in terms of settlement, pioneering, and oppression with settlement and colonialism in general. And the food chiefs are there to remind people to look deeper. And what did Pandozzi mean? What did he really bring? And what did he bring to the Indigenous people of this area? So it became an entrance into that contemplation at a time when really nobody was thinking about that in terms of what was being put out for commemorating history in the Valley. And was it enough? No, it wasn't enough. Was it problematic? Yeah, it was problematic. It was something that later a friend of mine, who I didn't know yet, but I came to know, he's Syilx, his name's Dixon Terbasket. I was researching for another piece, which was to create a similar weight in presence to this piece, which was commissioned by West Bank First Nation, which was a bronze sculpture of Chief Supershoot, who was a contemporary of Father Pandozzi. So they knew each other and they worked together at times. And they also had their own disagreements, definitely. So that particular commission spanned about 10 years of research for me. And I'll talk about some of the work I did in the meantime between doing this Father Pandozzi sculpture, which was unveiled in 2012. And, but I had started that work in 2009, and the Chief Supershoot monument, which was unveiled in 2019. But from doing this work, by doing this work and doing the research for this piece, I started to realize, like, what are we doing when we put down a sculpture, when we put down a monument? Whose story are we telling? Who are we telling it to? And who's telling it? And what are we perpetuating with the monuments that we place? And that goes for signage and any kind of commemorative work that goes into the public sphere. So this is one of the pieces from the Hands of Time. It's carving a canoe paddle. So when I went down to Victoria, Elder Butch Dick was generous to meet with me. And he picked me up from the ferry, and he drove me around Victoria and showed me different areas that had belonged to his people and had been taken, or where they were forced out from, including areas around the Parliament buildings, and the hotel, and very prime, what's considered very prime real estate in Victoria was once camps, important lands for his people, and still are. And so I talked to him about how I might approach this particular commemorative work more sensitively, without just perpetuating the history of Victoria in terms of in one-dimensional terms. There's a great deal of history there from a lot of different people and a lot of different aspects that make up the past in that area. So 150 years is not a long time, but a lot has happened. And this particular piece was created in collaboration with Butch Dick's son, Clarence Dick, who's also an artist. Butch Dick is a well-known artist. He has beautiful pieces in Victoria as well. And Clarence modeled for this piece, his hands, it's his carving knife as well. And he carved the canoe paddle that was then cast and used in this sculpture. So that collaboration was very important. And the acknowledgements of his contribution to it became very important as well. And this piece, Digging for Camas Bulbs, another piece, this is at Beacon Hill Park, which was an important gathering area, also to gather these bulbs that were used as a staple food source. And Carolyn Memnook from the Tsuk Nation modeled for this. And she created she wove the basket that holds the camas bulbs. So these were important collaborations for a piece that was also broader. And, we had different pieces like this cupping dogwood, symbolic of just the provincial flower, symbolic of the tourism industry, holding binoculars. Panning for gold, part of the gold rush. Raising a teacup. And this is tying a rope to a mooring ring that alluded to the seafaring and the shipping in the area. So this piece has, there's more pieces, I'm not showing them all here. But the idea is that people come across these, they're not grandiose, they're quite quiet pieces. You may or you may not find them. If you come across them randomly, you might not know what they're speaking of, but the idea was that it would pique curiosity and you might want to explore further to find out. So these all can be found with the map and the brochure. What these pieces led me to, and the collaborations and the learning that I experienced through reading, engagement with Indigenous culture, talking to people, talking to elders, it started to make me realize more and more just what we are doing with when we are celebrating things like celebrating anniversaries, celebrating the sesquicentennial Canada, for example. It led me to working with an Indigenous-led initiative called the Rethink 150 Indigenous Truth Collective and Initiative. And the idea for this was to create awareness around Indigenous perspectives of the sesquicentennial of Canada, and that it wasn't seen by a lot of people as the celebration that it was being advertised as. The big yellow duck that sailed into Ottawa for some people seemed pretty frivolous on the heels of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings that had gone on for years all across Canada. And these really important, heartfelt events that we were talking about had preceded the sesquicentennial of Canada, and people were surprised that this didn't become an opportunity to talk about all of those issues. And yet it was somewhat bypassed for the celebrations that felt frivolous to many. So this initiative had asked me to create this art for a billboard, and it ended up on several billboards around the Okanagan. And it was to raise awareness of what colonialism has meant for the Indigenous peoples of this land. It was created out of a series of 7 discussions with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants. And we came upon imagery that we discussed being utilized in this work, a general feeling for the work. And so this was created and put up in events that were really lovely to be a part of, really important to be a part of, where we ate together. We brought these big billboard vinyls up to Billboards and put them up together with ladders and hammers and drills. And it was a really beautiful time. There were children involved, people from lots of different demographics. These were put up on reserve lands, on billboards on reserves. And the Terbasket family was very influential in this piece and raising this piece, both in the Similkameen and near Duck Lake. This is just an image of some people gathered, putting up the billboard in the Similkameen. And this is the Terbasket family sitting near that billboard, which is still there. That led to some more work that I took a more supportive role of an Indigenous artist, a Syilx artist named Sheldon Lewis. And Dixon there on the left in the orange shirt and Sheldon in the black hoodie worked together with me, supporting them in bringing some of this information about Indigenous history to a grade 12 honors class at Kelowna Senior Secondary School, where they discussed the history of oppression of their people, the ongoing struggles, the gains, the resilience. And Sheldon led the students through coming up with imagery and ideas to create a new billboard that we raised the following year. And this is his billboard that he worked with the grade 12 students. And this was, on the other side of that is the billboard I created with the Rethink initiative. And this is the billboard he created with the grade 12 students. This also went up around the same time of year when we're celebrating Canada Day. Some of my work when I was working in this realm, and I do still sometimes, but it's not always what I'm doing. And I wanted to find ways of creating work that was very much centered within the imagery from my own culture, because part of what became difficult was like creating imagery or using imagery that was really not from my own history. And so I wanted to see what would it be like to deconstruct my own culture, my own history. And so Knox Mountain is a well-used hill in Kelowna. A lot of people go there just to get out in nature, to climb it, to get exercise. And there's a series of 9 plaques at the first lookout called the Crown Lookout. And there is a lot of settler history on these plaques, pretty low-key stories about, I think there's a picture here. Yeah, there's a man from Scotland. He came, he felt homesick. So he named this whole area of land that he had access to as Ben Volin, which is the name that it has today as well, which was a name that came from his homeland in Scotland. So these were put up at the centennial. And so with the sesquicentennial, it seemed like an opportunity to do something a little different with it. And so I created a piece of work called Viewpoint, and it was a poem that was on plaques that looked very much like the plaques that were up there. And there's a series of 9 of these, each with a line from the poem. These are people who came to it was a participatory art work where people came, we discussed how place claiming happens through signage, through monuments, through what we put on the land, what the stories we tell, the stories that we in this way insist upon. So we had these discussions. Dixon Terbasket spoke, as well as Joanne Hammond, who had been doing some similar work with the road signs, the BC Heritage road signs that you come across in BC that do the same thing in terms of place claiming. She had been doing a Photoshop version, raising questions about this place claiming strategy and what is omitted from these stories. And so I was working on something similar. We found each other, we came together for this discussion and with members of the community to place the plaques. And this is just one of the plaques in the resin that's made to look like bronze. And this is the poem. I have plaster casts of them. I like this place. I'm going to take it. Make it mine. Through force, design. Name it anew. Make a sign. Impose my story. Stake my claim. Belie my crime. So we put those up. Oh, that's the next one. We put those up near Canada Day and kept them up for a while, documented it, talked about it. And some of this was shared through social media and such venues as that. And it just was to try to center myself within my own culture, within my own history, and to raise questions through this poem and through the signage. These were all pieces that were done over the span of about 10 years. A lot of them happened within the last 5. And it was leading me through this whole time. It was informing my work for the Chief Supershoot Monument, which I saw as a really a big responsibility, a real honor to have been asked to do that work by West Bank First Nation as what became an answer to what I was feeling very uncomfortable with the Father Pandozzi sculpture being an homage to West Bank to Seal culture, but not an equal representation. And my friend Dixon, who I ended up working with, I wanted to tell this story. I was researching for the Supershoot sculpture. I was at a Truth and Reconciliation event at the Kelowna Friendship Center. And I ended up talking to Dixon, who said, yeah, I'm going to go look at that sculpture. I'm going to go look at that sculpture, Father Pandozzi, and then I'm going to talk to you about it. So we did that. And when we sat down to talk about it, he said, well, when I saw that work, I wanted to chisel the food chiefs off of this priest. To me, it was really, these things don't belong together. You know, these are spiritual images from my culture. And here they are sort of on the robes of this symbol for me of oppression. And I had never thought of it in those terms before. And it seems quite obvious that should be a consideration now, but at that time I hadn't thought in that way. But it made me realize just who was I talking to with that sculpture. I wasn't talking to, I wasn't trying to reach the Indigenous community. It was the settler community. Those, the food chiefs were to be an entranceway into thinking about Indigenous perspective, but it didn't occur to me that it could be seen as so inappropriate and hurtful in some ways as well. So there was a lot of great work that we did together, a lot of thinking, a lot of, I don't regret having made that sculpture. I think that I tried to make the considerations thoughtfully and in collaboration, but we change over time. Individuals change over time, society changes over time, perspectives change over time, and these are good things. And so pieces of artwork that are raised at one time and mean something at one time or perceived in one way, over time are going to change for individuals, for the people who make them, and for the people who come to see them, and for the society in general. So I accept that as part of the work. The Chief Supershoot Monument was raised in 2012 on National Indigenous Peoples Day. And for this one, I can't talk too much longer because I can see I've already spoken for about half an hour. But this piece was done with a lot of consultation, also a lot of research into what sorts of garb and garments and artifacts would be used at that time by a chief like Supershoot. And again, the food chiefs are represented through different symbolic elements on the sculpture. There's a lot of symbolism in this sculpture. This was the unveiling. This was Chief Roxanne Lindley, who is a descendant of this family that Chief Supershoot is from. So there was a good turnout to this. It was a really interesting time to create a piece like this as a non-Indigenous artist. And I had to speak with West Bank First Nation and talk to them and say, are you sure? Do you still want me to make this? It's been about 10 years in the making, in the works. Like things have changed. Monuments are coming down across Canada, across North America. And for this piece to be done by someone like me is going to raise a lot of questions. And they said, well, yeah, we want you to do this. And so I completed the work, and it stands near the waterfront in Kelowna. And it stands mostly as a representation and a reminder that the Syilx people are here, that they are powerful, that they're resilient, and that we have a great deal to learn from them, from the philosophies of stewardship of the land, of reciprocity with the land, and of taking care of the land and stewardship. And I am hoping that this will, it was unveiled in an act of reconciliation with the city of Kelowna and West Bank First Nation. And the hope is that this becomes, in the spirit of monuments that have been erected all across Canada, this becomes a different sort of monument that makes us think about monuments in general, what they're perpetrating, and how we might think differently about the monuments themselves and ourselves as we go forward. So I will end it there for questions.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I want to invite our participants. If you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and to ask, or you're also welcome to write your question in the chat, and I'll be moderating the chat. Maybe I could start it off. I've been jotting down notes. You've said so many beautiful things and really, really important things, but I want to ask a question about your material process. When you mentioned casting different people's hands and their objects for these sculptures, I wonder if you could talk more about the material process of doing. You also mentioned resin made to look like bronze, which is so interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the easy questions. So the resin, yeah, it's just a polyurethane resin, 2-part epoxy type of resin that I actually added bronze powder into. So there's bronze on the surface of that sculpture, of those pieces. And I cast them into plexiglass forms, and just measured the signs, made sure that everything was very similar, that they would fit just right. And so that's a bit of a straightforward process with using that material and a mold making process. The Hands of Time, I worked with a lot of life casts, which was done with alginate and temporary plaster molds. So that was, it was a long time ago now, but then I worked these sculptures as well. I cast them into clay. I worked the clay and added details and gesture and that kind of thing. And added the other elements into those pieces and then had to create new molds of those works to go through the lost wax process of having them cast into bronze. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, it's I'm making kind of correlations between the material process and then also maybe the metaphorical or like the larger ideological process of the research and the returning and the reworking.
Yeah. I mean, this bronze, it's not, it lasts a long time. It's used for monuments for these reasons and public sculptures that are outside for these reasons. It's beautiful, but in terms of sustainability and the mining that's involved with getting these resources out of the ground and that kind of thing, there is a paradox in using a material like that with a piece like Chief Supershoot, which is it raises questions, it raises considerations, and it's a strange juxtaposition of philosophies and ideologies and histories.
I have a question. Crystal, I think we spoke earlier, but I grew up on the West Bank First Nations territory, and as a child would often, get taken on field trips to Father Pandosi's farm, I guess it was called, and of course a very different narrative back in those days because I am in my 50s. And I'm just curious, like your interactions then with sort of settler people with the monuments and the reworking and the rethinking of what a monument is, what it's saying, and how, you're sort of part of the process of refocusing people's attention or sort of creating a different narrative. And how has that gone with, we've spoken about the First Nations people, but on the other side?
Yeah, that was a really interesting and somewhat discouraging process because one thing that was encouraging is that these pieces were brought forward with non-conventional elements to them, both with Victoria and the sesquicentennial there, and the sesquicentennial of the Father Pandosi mission, and they were embraced. So that was nice. That it wasn't like I wasn't sure whether the vision could be shared or would be shared enough to make these things happen, but they were accepted. So there was acceptance. At the same time, a lot of the press that was around, especially the Father Pandosi sculpture, even though the press release very explicitly included this collaboration as one of the most important aspects of this work, it was not picked up on. So this is 2012. So it was kind of written out, and it was very peculiar because there it was in black and white for people to look at and to write about. And for me, it's such an exciting aspect of the work, and yet it was left out of the narrative. And I don't know if that was because of, again, sort of you just catering to the readership, and you're not writing difficult things. You're not writing things that would create problems or stretch the imagination, or whether there was a real protectiveness around Father Pandosi and wanting to maintain him in this traditional way as the folk hero and to not have to think about these things surrounding it, and just the lack of language around it. This was preceding a lot of the truth and reconciliation awareness that we've gained over the years, and all of that work. I mean, it was happening, but it was in the beginning stages. I mean, now the reporting is very different. It would have been picked up on absolutely as one of the most important aspects. So the TRC has made a difference, is making a difference, needs to continue. There's still so much work to be done. But it's been gratifying. I've been happy to see that change and that shift over time.
I'll ask a question. I'm sorry, my camera is off. I wasn't prepared for camera on today, but you can see a beautiful picture. That does not look like me right now. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Crystal, for all of this. I was very peripherically familiar with your work through the hands of time, through some research that I've been doing, but this has been very, very enlightening and refreshing to see, even like the way that you're describing the evolution of, or the evolution of your process and discoveries along the way. So thank you so much. I was curious to know what you are doing right now. What are you working on right now? And what's your involvement currently with First Nations groups versus, in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the project that I'm working on now is for art is a project for City Centre 3 in Surrey, and that's a series of 7 sculptures, and it speaks to art and technology. Sorry, not art and technology, science and technology, and growth in these areas. And so this is a very different kind of work. It's an abstract, they're abstract pieces. And it's very different. And I'm not working in collaboration with the Indigenous community there. So, I mean, initially I thought about that. I thought, well, how can I put anything up without the collaboration of the Indigenous community? And that's a question. Or how can it not be about these settler indigenous relations? But just as I do a lot of things without collaboration, part of my work is also outside of that, and never completely outside of it. It's always in consideration of it. It's always there. Like, you can't escape it. You can't sidestep it, whether you're addressing it directly or not. It's absolutely part of the complicity of all of this, and that's our lives in general, as well. Like, here I am, I have a house, I have a family, we're living here. I was born here. These children were mostly born here. This is complicated. This is home, yet this is unceded territory, yet I'm part of an oppressive culture, yet this is complicated stuff. I go to the grocery store, I buy these things, we bring things from abroad, we use these things every day. And sometimes we think about those in terms of being settler descendants on this land or settlers on this land, and sometimes we don't. And my work isn't different than that. I have a wide variety of interests. I have a wide variety of approaches. But this is always there. This is always there in my thinking about what I'm doing, but not overtly in what I'm doing.
No, it makes sense. I think that is the challenge, but at the same time, the beauty of, or the power of public art is that you can speak to all of these different things and how to acknowledge them all. It's always the challenge, how to acknowledge all the relevant narratives, depending on where the artwork is and who you're speaking to.
Yeah, and in some cases they're more about that. Like in the case of commemorating history, I mean, it's certainly something that needs to be thought about and integrated. Those become public sculptures that are very much about this very issue and very explicitly. So I think it requires that thought and that input and that collaboration.
That's great. Thank you for your answer. It's good to learn more about you. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have another question, Crystal, too. Talking about materials, and especially sort of monuments that are generally outside and so require a certain type of material that will sort of stand the test of time, or maybe with monuments, maybe not, right? Depending on how your philosophy in approaching it. And so, yeah, you were talking about it being problematic with using some mined type materials for your monuments. Like, you know, I know the Uji people in Quebec for decades had been moved off their lands every time a new mining company or a forestry company would come in. And, you know, it's a terrible history. So I'm wondering, are you working with any new materials, or do you have any ideas or approaches, or maybe hopes to do projects or monuments that sort of have a different approach to materials?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different approaches out there. I mean, the work that I did with dialogical and participatory art was very interesting to be a part of. So there's all kinds of potentials out there, and as an instructor, it's interesting to work with the students and talk about these different potentials for working differently. So it's never something that I rule out. But each piece has its own requirements. Each commission has its own requirements. Like, I don't pretend that I'm not part of needing to make a living, needing to support the 4 children that are part of my family, you know, needing to do those things and create works that speak on different levels for different reasons and different outcomes. But having situations in which you can really create something very different is nice to have. I had that when I was working on my thesis and my master's of fine arts, you know, where you had the space and the time and the resources to do work in that way. So it's also who will fund it, who will support that initiative. There's stuff, of course, there's funding out there, there's opportunities out there, but it's important that is part of what can happen. These developments tend to want permanent pieces of art. I mean, there's a lot of money for public sculpture and through developments, and but through municipalities, they might be more open to working differently and working more temporarily. It doesn't need to last forever. But it is interesting to have these pieces last a long time and see how society shifts in their perspectives as well. I enjoy that process of watching society grow and change and shift. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, let me just go back in the chat here. Yeah, if there aren't any more questions, then we may end 10 minutes early. I just want to thank you so much, Crystal, for speaking about your work, and with such a I don't know, like a tone of like acceptance and openness, and recognizing change in culture, and yeah, it's really refreshing to hear. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. I mean, I can talk a little bit more to it all. I could have probably talked more up front at the beginning, but you never know how many questions are going to come in. But I can just talk a little bit more broadly to that learning process, if that's.
Yeah, sure.
More minutes. I think that having had the opportunities extended to me was, you know, a very important part of my learning process. So I don't want to take the credit for that. It's, you know, that Westbank First Nation asked me to do a project that basically supported my research, right? It supported my ability to go into that and learn so much, and take several years to do that. There's not everybody has that opportunity. So one of the most important books that I read was Unsettling the Settler Within by Paulette Reagan. She was a research director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was an extremely important book for me to start to recognize that I needed to to look at myself first, my history first. I mean, that was the first time I really looked into my family history. There, really started to become, I had a general sense of it, but to get more of the details of why did people come over from England at that time? Why did people come over from Wales? Why did they come over from Germany? What did they do? Some came over for land. Absolutely. It was being offered, and they came over and they took land. Some were escaping religious persecution and some were escaping post-war situation. But, we landed here, and what feels like such a long time. It's so easy to assume we've been here. It feels like a long time, as though it always was. And 150 years, 200 years is such a blip on the timeline of these lands and what has occurred on this land. So to learn about that, what came before, even though there's no buildings, even though there weren't monuments per se from the time before colonialization, there is the land itself. And those are landmarks that were very important, I know, to the Syilx people. And my friend Dixon would show me some of these landmarks and show me some of the details of them and the important places. And there's a whole history and stories, the chaptikul, which are the important stories that contain learning that are handed down generation to generation, are built around this land and these the mountains, the formations. And so as we build upon these, we are destroying those monuments, right? We're destroying those, we're obscuring them. We are building them over with our own stories, with our own history, not just in terms of signs or monuments, but houses, like malls, roads. This is all part of how we are erasing the history of this area, is sort of taking away the land. And so that stewardship, Jeanette Armstrong is a Syilx scholar, and from this area, she was also very influential to read about her work. And she's very generous and very warm. And she writes in terms of how we, as settlers, we can learn about the Syilx approach to land, the indigenous approach to the stewardship and the reciprocity, and that through that we can shift our own society and our own philosophies and worldviews in a way that will better align with the indigenous philosophies and worldviews. And so that's where reconciliation can come from, is that bridging that gap in our perspectives of how we approach the land, and that we're part of it. So these were really important learnings for me, and they've shifted my life, in small ways. And I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I had to devote the time and to meet people and to discuss it. And I hope to continue some work with the Indigenous community here. But it can't just come from me. Like, it also doesn't feel right to be pursuing like my own artistic opportunities, with the Indigenous community. I feel like I need to be receptive to being asked and to being included if that comes up, and to make myself ready for that engagement.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Yeah, very thoughtful. Any final kind of follow-up questions? There's a lot of thank yous in the chat here from Mike, from Simona. Yeah, I think you're, particularly for those who are in the Victoria area, the Hands of Time are really like a resonant piece, that have, to be able to stumble upon something. Like you said, it's a very quiet sculpture. I think it resonates with many people here. But if there are...
Hi, I just wanted to say really quickly, thank you so much. That was so like refreshing and grounding, and I learned so much. I'm in the Brooklyn area. I just joined the Creative Mornings team as head of partnerships. And so I'm trying to get to as many of these lovely community interactions as possible. And I learned so much from you. And I think it's applicable no matter where you are, right? Because we're all on some component or some piece of land. So I'm definitely going to look at things with a different perspective and a new light. So thank you so much. And your artwork was just beautiful, and just very thought-provoking and very empowering. So thanks so much for sharing your process and your wise words too, so much.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody for this opportunity and for joining and listening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think we'll end it here. I wish everybody like a safe and restful weekend. And this recording will be posted online on our Creative Mornings page, probably sometime this weekend. Yes, thank you. Take care. Thank you, Crystal.
Bye.